Hello again, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this Wednesday's edition of Alaska Weather. Up first on the first hazardous weather graphic, we've got a winter weather advisory up here for the western Arctic coast, still out, and continues out through tonight and into till about noontime tomorrow, and that's for winds gusting to 45 miles an hour to the northeast there, creating blowing snow, or actually winds gusting to 35 miles an hour out of the northeast, creating wind chills to 45 degrees below zero, with also some areas of blowing and drifting snow, reducing visibilities quite a bit. And then the next area here is northern panhandle, once again, snow advisory, and that goes into effect midnight tonight until 6 p.m. Thursday, and that's for possibly 2 to 5 inches of snow, and the area is mainly along the Klondike and Haines highways, with the heavier snow amounts, the 5 inches up towards the Haines Highway or Haines up toward White Pass in those areas. And that's it for the watches, warnings, and advisories. And for satellite imagery, see one band of moisture moving through the panhandle early on, already into Canada, and just some showers across the area today with a weak trough that extends across the panhandle. You can see up along the North Gulf Coast and here through the western interior there across the Yukon River. Some areas of light snow with that and snow showers. And another band here lifting northward brought some light snow or rain and snow into the Seldovia-Homer area today, and some light snow up into Portage this afternoon at times, but amounts pretty light there. Some light snow over the eastern interior extended all the way up into the Yukon Flats with some clouds there, mostly kind of hard to see here. Higher top clouds back here to the west and northwest, and then the cold air continuing to come southward there through the Bering Strait and out of the Russian Far East here. You can see the cold air, once it gets out over the open water, picks those clouds up, or the clouds form here, and so pretty cloudy conditions with a lot of snow showers, areas of light snow all the way down to the Aleutians there, and colder air yet back out toward Shimia there. You can see a lot of snow showers just to the west and southwest of Shimia Island, and otherwise amounts again light out in that area. Winds not quite as strong as they were yesterday, really coming down here even through the Bering Strait. About 30-35 mile an hour still gusts St. Lawrence Island area. And rolling that through again, this next system down here, the front kind of fragmenting out, at least initially there, a couple of several bands, this one right through here, another one there, and then the main front back down through here in the low center, south of Kodiak Island, moving northeast, take a turn a little bit to the north and then slow down. That'll allow the front to continue to swing northeastward there later tonight and into tomorrow, bringing increasing wind and rain into the North Gulf Coast and the Panhandle. On the chart today, there's that weak trough that brought some showers into the southeast coast today. Amounts range from about 1/10 of an inch or so to maybe up to, or Heidelberg had about 1/10 of an inch of rain today and about 700ths of Juneau. So pretty light rainfall amounts there. Cutting off here in the North Gulf Coast area, those were some areas of light snow, like I mentioned, Portage, and then some slipped on up into the Seldovia-Homer area, Kachemak Bay, and otherwise some light snow from Eagle, actually all the way down to Tok, anywhere from 1/2 inch to 1 inch up toward Eagle into Fort Yukon, and up to the Arctic coast there. And this trough producing some areas of light snow and snow showers, but again, very light, generally 1 inch or less in those areas. McGrath picked up about 1 inch of snow today, and Bethel 1/2 inch to 1 inch. So pretty light snow, kind of widespread through here, especially once it gets out over the open water of the Bering Sea, with the ice edge now down to St. Matthew, actually south of St. Matthew Island, but still well north of the Pribilofs there, with this cold air continuing to pour southward, or southwestward, and then southward, and then a trough out here to a stronger low toward the Komodorskis, increase the snow showers out toward that location. And for tonight, not much change out there, about the same pattern. Light winds, though, across this Bering Sea, and still a little breezy. Northeast winds continue, north to northeast winds there. Mostly along the southwest coast, a little gusty, but pretty light through the Bering Strait, at least as far as compared to what you've seen, but still stays pretty gusty up here, this trough persisting, weak low pressure there over the North Tack Valley. so that'll keep those winds gusting to 35 miles an hour, and the snow advisories for the western Arctic coast for tonight into tomorrow. Areas of light snow, flurries, fog, eastern, maybe even the central Arctic coast, becoming dry here over the eastern and northeast interior, and then still some snow shower chances for the eastern Alaska range, and rain and snow on the increase, along with winds coming up, gale force winds moving into the Gulf of Alaska and eventually in toward the coast of the Panhandle, with increasing rain and wind and snow all along the North Gulf Coast, maybe coming into increasing chances, I'll put it that way, into Cook Inlet, more so there for the southern Kenai Peninsula. Rain and snow, Kodiak Island, with that low center now parking just south of Sitkinak Island. Snow in the colder air back here over the Bristol Bay area, pushing down into the Alaska Peninsula. And then there's still an area of light snow here with this trough from the Kuskokwim Valley, western Alaska Range actually, all the way up to the western Arctic coast. And in toward Kotzebue Sound, Bering Strait, light winds, dry conditions, maybe some clearing there, as well as possible clearing over the eastern interior North Slope. Tomorrow, that trough still bringing light snow up to the northwest part of the state into the western central Arctic coast, kind of breaking off now. Dry conditions at Kuskokwim Valley. This front pushing gale force winds, rain and snow into the North Gulf Coast. Becomes more showery once you get inland. Copper River Basin, maybe some snow showers hanging up in the Alaska Range. Nothing north of the mountains. Rain and snow here across the southeast coast, and light snow for the Alaska Peninsula. Light winds over the Bering Sea, and a lot of leftover snow showers for the Aleutians, all the way out to the Komodorskis. And then for Friday, moisture with this trough finally lifts mostly off the Arctic coast there up into the Arctic and the Chukchi Sea. So pretty dry over in the northern interior, with pretty good chance of some clearing from the Tanana Valley up into the Yukon Flats to the eastern North Slope areas. Very strong low, backing it up one. This low here, actually a low that's south of the chart there, moves northeastward Thursday night and Friday, and by Friday afternoon, this low south of Kodiak gets completely absorbed into this system. See a very tight gradient with this storm, so look for gale, possibly storm force winds moving into the coastal areas of the Panhandle, with rain moderate to heavy at times, lighter to the north, better chance of some snow up over the northern areas, and some of that will push in across the North Gulf Coast and into south central Alaska as well. Probably snow over the western Kenai Peninsula, Cook Inlet, into the valleys, but pretty light in the Copper River Basin, and north winds keep it snowy and chilly there for the Bristol Bay area and Alaska Peninsula. Scattered snow showers. We've got some ridging coming down out of the Russian Far East here into the northern and eastern Bering Sea, so look for light winds and just scattered snow showers, maybe some clearing. Stronger storm comes up into the western Aleutians, 970 millibar low there. So western Aleutians looking at snow changing to rain in the central Aleutians, with gale force winds associated with that, especially up over the southwest Bering Sea. And from there, let's see, moving on to low temperatures for tonight. We've got lows in the 30s here for the southeast coast, 5 below to 5 above in the Copper River Basin, teens and 20s south central Alaska, 5 above to 10 below in the Kuskokwim Valley, 15 to 20 for the Bristol Bay area, lower 30s Kodiak Island, followed by highs near 40 for Kodiak tomorrow, upper 30s for the North Gulf Coast, inland areas though in the 20s, mid to upper, lower 30s here for the Bristol Bay area, and a little bit above zero there for McGrath and Nikolai, about 8 in the central Copper River Basin, and mid-30s for Yakutat, mid to upper 30s in the northern Panhandle, lower 40s to the south, followed by lows Friday morning, not much different, mid-30s to the north, lower 40s to the south, and then highs Friday afternoon, 35 to 45, 15 teens for the Copper River Basin, 5 to 15 in the Kuskokwim Valley, mid-30s for Kodiak Island, up to the north, lows tonight, basically below zero, all areas, even St. Lawrence Island, down around 10 below, and North Slope, the coldest there, 15 to 20 below over the North Slope. Highs tomorrow, single numbers here in the central and northern interior, and maybe a little below zero out to the west. Definitely below zero for the Arctic coast and North Slope, followed by lows in the 5 to 15 below range over the eastern interior, 5 to 15 below or 10 to 15 below for the Seward Peninsula, all the way up to the Arctic coast, followed by highs. Single numbers, North Slope Arctic coast staying below zero, as well as the Bering Strait Strait down to St. Lawrence Island. And for the southwest coast, lows tonight below zero, 20s for the Alaska Peninsula, and mid-20s for the central Aleutians, mid-teens for the Pribilofs, high only 17 for St. Paul, St. George tomorrow, lower 30s central Aleutians, near freezing here, Dutch Harbor up toward Cold Bay, and then lows again below zero here along the southwest coast, Macoriac, teens for the Pribilofs, 20s for the Aleutians, followed by highs near 20 for St. Paul, stays cold in the southwest coast, mid-30s for the Aleutians.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Taking a look at the aviation forecast by looking at the flying weather for Thursday morning, looking at IFR conditions through the Gulf there. From a low pressure system coming into the region, we'll be seeing that over the next couple days. Otherwise, some marginal conditions down through the Panhandle, up through the northern Gulf, over into portions of Alaska Range, and also into the West Coast and Arctic coast as well, and also into the Bering Sea. Then for flying weather, Thursday afternoon, lingering IFR conditions there along the Gulf of Alaska, coastal areas, and then IFR conditions lingering down there in the southern Panhandle. Otherwise, marginal conditions in the rest of the Panhandle and up through the West Coast and Arctic coast and down through the Bering Sea. Flying weather for Friday morning, looking at IFR conditions spread through much of the Panhandle into the Gulf, coastal areas, and into the southern portions of the Cook Inlet there, and also IFR conditions along the Alaska Peninsula, and low clouds expected over there in the YK Delta, otherwise marginal conditions through much of the West and Arctic coast continuing, and also marginal conditions through much of the Bering Sea as we see another low pressure system approaching the western Aleutians with IFR conditions out there. For flying weather Friday afternoon, looking at IFR conditions again through much of the Panhandle into the Gulf, over into the Bristol Bay region, and lingering IFR conditions in the YK Delta, otherwise marginal conditions through much of the West Coast and up through the Northwest Coast over in the Arctic coast as well, and IFR conditions down there in the western Aleutians. For past conditions on Thursday, anticlimatic fast VFR decreasing to marginal. Same for Adigan. Then for Lake Clark and Merrill down in Alaska Range, marginal conditions down there. And then for rainy, marginal conditions. A little bit of better weather flying weather up there in Windy Pass with VFR conditions. Isabel VFR. Mentasta VFR as well, Tanita VFR decreasing to marginal, and then Portage marginal decreasing to IFR conditions again with that low clouds and ceilings moving in with the next low pressure system, and then Chilkoot and White marginal conditions expected. For freezing levels Thursday morning, surface freezing level coming across the Aleutians into Kodiak Island over into the Golden Gulf, then down through the Panhandle, elevated freezing levels down there south of the Gulf of Alaska. For icing conditions on Thursday, looking at above 4,000 feet in portions of the Gulf there with considerable moderate possibilities, also considerable possibilities above 3,000 feet, otherwise isolated moderate approaching much of the West Coast down through the Bering and over into the Gulf region. For the jet stream, low pressure systems analyzed out there in extreme eastern Russia, otherwise westerlies cutting across the northern portion of the mainland with up to anywhere between 30 and 35 knots there, otherwise strong westerlies down through the Gulf, anywhere between 100 and 115 knots coming across there through the Panhandle. As you get into the northern Gulf, decreasing to around 30 knots. Then for 9,000 foot winds, low pressure systems analyzed through much of the Bering Sea region out there in the western Aleutians, Bristol Bay, otherwise some southwesterly flow coming across the Gulf region, anywhere between 35 and 45 knots coming into the Panhandle, otherwise light and variable across much of the mainland. For 3,000 foot winds, looking at low pressure systems through the Bering Strait out there in the western Aleutians and south of the Alaska Peninsula, otherwise generally westerly flow coming into the Panhandle up to 40 knots there, the rest of the mainland basically light and variable. For turbulence, not much to speak of here, otherwise we're going to be going with isolated moderate across much of the region across the Gulf, anywhere between surface and 4,000 feet, in the area between basically Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, into the Cook Inlet region, upwards of anywhere between surface and 6,000 feet as you get into the Gulf region, from the northern Gulf down through much of the Panhandle, with again a surface of 6,000 foot freezing turbulence levels there. And I also went for isolated severe in portions of the southern Panhandle, and again isolated moderate through much of that region, again associated with the next low pressure system moving in there.
We have a big solar flare coming in, so we're out here on an aurora hunt. It's a CME, it's dynamite, coronal mass ejection. It's when the sun, it kicks off energy in these explosions that are larger than the Earth, explosion type things coming off of sunspots. And if that energy is pointing straight at the Earth, it gets caught up in our magnetic field, and that energy, electrons, come down our magnetic field, collide with oxygen up there about 50 or a couple hundred miles high, and that's what generates the northern lights. My job as the photographer and the aurora hunter is to be in position, you know, location, location, location. And I like to think I'm composing. Mother Nature, it's a bit of a teamwork thing, you know, she's got to put on the show, but I have to be in the right position and, of course, with the right tools and the know-how. I've stopped keeping track of how much time I spend out here in terms of hours. It's more in terms of weeks or months, or at this point, years now. You know, it was always in me. Even when I was a kid growing up in the lower 48, I would spend nights sleeping on our trampoline, just staring at the stars. I'm in 4th grade and I'm going, wow, look at those stars. And I'd see how many nights in a row I could sleep on the trampoline. And I think my record was 23 nights in a row. So I was doing kind of strange things for an Iowa country boy. I can remember specifically the very first time I saw the Northern Lights. It was 1989, the peak of the solar cycle, and I was going to graduate school in Laramie, Wyoming. And all of a sudden we had heard the Northern Lights were out. It's like, what are those? I'd never really seen them before. And my goodness gracious, we were on top of a mountain in the Laramie Range and they were turning blood red. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And the very first picture I took, that was 1990. Now, an old film camera, Pentax K1000 on a plastic Kmart tripod. Took 2 shots on slide film and got them back. And I thought, oh my gosh, this beautiful green thing swirling about. And from that moment, I was hooked. When I realized that you could preserve the auroras on film, I just experimented a ton. I'd had a heaping stack of slides, the no good ones. The experiments gone wrong, you know, too dark, fuzzy, out of focus, too light. I had this huge garbage can full of excess slide film, and that was just the learning curve. Well, when I go out here, it's all about getting the shot. And my wife and I, we've called it the hero shot. But the hero shot is the one where you just come home and you go, look at this. And everyone goes, wow, and you feel like a hero. It's a wonderful feeling, you know, it's good for the ego, of course, it's good for the business, but if you kind of strip that away, it's good for what's inside you, because that's really the hero moment in nature. And Mother Nature's putting on this show that is just mind-blowing. It's unbelievable. When I first resigned from my day job, that was in 1996, and decided I wanted to become a full-time aurora hunter, my goal from that moment and to this day still is to get one hero shot a year. I figured, and I'm talking the kind that somebody wants to buy from you and hang on their wall, where the auroras are extremely bright, very active, turning colors, where you can't believe your eyes. If you're going to preserve a little sample of that with a photograph, well, it's what we call the hero shot. Wow, what a feeling. I mean, you're elevated, levitating, you are lifted up, your spirits are so high that I love that feeling, and I think I get that so much from seeing cool things in nature that I will go way out of my way to find that. And I can, the next day, well, I'll be just laying there thinking about it and thinking how lucky I was, or how fortunate. Of course, I just spent 2 weeks sitting there staring at the sky and not seeing anything. So you got to remember that luck is kind of a relative term. But I still just feel incredibly lucky to be even in a position to where I could have been there, taken a photograph of it, and just mainly experienced it. Well, that feeling could last for days.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. Moving into marine forecasts. Good gales coming into the coast with that next front rolling on up for Thursday. South winds 40 knots along the central and south coast. North coast, east-southeasterlies 40 to 45 knots. And gale warnings developing for Clarence Strait out of the southeast at 35 knots. Stevens Passage, gale force gusts from the southeast to 45 knots. And Lynn Canal, south winds increasing to 25 knots, seas building to 5 feet. For the day Friday, here central south coast, almost a storm warning. Right now it looks like 45 knots will cover it pretty good right out of the south, seas 20 to 25 feet. Lighter winds on the north coast, 30 to 35 knots out of the east-southeast. Gale warnings for Clarence Strait. South winds 35 knots, central northern inner channels. Southeast winds 25 knots. For the North Gulf Coast tomorrow, east winds 40 to 45 knots, strongest around Middleton Island. Prince William Sound, small craft advisories. Northeast winds 30 knots, seas up to 7 feet. And for Cook Inlet, gale warnings south of the Forelands for north winds at 35 knots, northeast 35 for Kamishak Bay, and east winds of 40 knots for the Barren Islands. And for Friday, pretty light winds here, northern Cook Inlet, east at about 10 or variable to east with slight seas, northwest 25. Southern Cook Inlet, even stronger gales there for Kamishak Bay, northwest winds 40 knots. And westerlies at about 35 knots for the Barren Islands, but the western North Gulf Coast, those west winds at 40 knots. Winds down to 20 knots in Prince William Sound from the north on Friday, and northeast winds 30 knots, 18-foot seas for the eastern North Gulf Coast. For Shelikof Strait tomorrow, northeast winds 35 knots, north 25-knot winds for Bristol Bay. Alaska Peninsula looking at north to northwest winds 20 to 30 knots. And for the day Friday, Alaska Peninsula northwest winds 25 to 30 knots, west at 30 for Bristol Bay, and then west winds 30 to 35 knots blowing across Kodiak Island. For the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, west and northwest winds 15 to 25 knots, seas running 7 to 14 feet. West winds 20 to 25 knots for the central Aleutians, and then south winds 30 knots for the western areas. And then on the day on Friday, you've got east winds 30 to 40 knots there for the western Aleutians. Central areas, Adak and Atka, east winds 30 to 35 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, north to east winds at 30 to 35 knots. For the southwest coast, tomorrow to Thursday, north winds 25 knots. North 25 for the Pribilos, north 20 for St. Matthew Island. St. Lawrence Island looking at a northwest wind at 20 knots, and just 10 knots knots there in Norton Sound. And for the day on Friday, northwest winds 15 knots, St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound, northwest 20 knots for the Yukon Delta coast, Kuskokwim Delta coast, northeast at 30 knots, and then 20 knot northeast winds for the Pueblos, northeast 15 for St. Matthew Island. And for the Chukchi tomorrow, west winds at 15 knots. Western Arctic coast, brisk wind advisories continue along with that winter weather advisory for northeast winds 25 knots, central coast northeast at 20, and northeast 10 to 15 for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. On Friday over there, pretty light winds north to northeast at 10 knots, down to 15 knots from the northeast for the central coast, and the western Arctic coast, east 10 to 15 knots, west 15 knots there for the Chukchi Sea. And for tonight, again, we're looking at still some flurries, low clouds, fog, possible for the central eastern Arctic coast. Areas of light snow and gusty winds to 35 miles an hour. Again, low wind chills to 45 below, some blowing snow along the western Arctic coast. Areas of light snow or snow showers along this trough, right on down into the possibly western Cook Inlet, Kuskokwim Valley. This system bringing increasing wind and rain into the North Gulf Coast and Panhandle tonight. Really no change out over the Bering Sea through tomorrow. With this front lifting northward, gale force winds along the coast, rain and snow into the Panhandle, especially the North Gulf Coast. But that cuts off pretty dramatically as you move inland there, with nothing getting north of the Alaska Range. And then for the day on Friday, big storm comes up out of the Northeast Pacific and absorbs the one south of Kodiak Island tomorrow. And you got this huge storm in the southern Gulf of Alaska, near storm force winds along the front there, especially in the offshore areas here where the gradient's the tightest. Rain moderate to heavy at times along the south coast of the Panhandle, rain and snow to the north. Better chances of moisture over southern Alaska.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.